The Congressional Progressive Caucus welcomed nearly a dozen new members this week after a majority of candidates they endorsed for this year's midterm elections were victorious. Representative Pramila Jayapal, chair of the CPC, said that this will be, quote, the most progressive Democratic caucus in decades, with over 100 members helping the group gain more power to deliver actual change on key issues such as student debt, child tax credit, expanding Medicaid, antitrust reform, and more.
Joining us now to discuss is Congressman from California and member of the Progressive Caucus, Ro Khanna. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back on.
So Representative Robbie just ran through a couple of issue areas that progressives might be excited about, but having lost the House, people are, I think, rightly focused on some of the things that Joe Biden promised to do via executive order, like student debt cancellation, which has recently hit a hang-up in the courts. Student debt advocates at Strike Debt, like Asher Taylor, have pointed out that if Biden had not means tested the program and had used the compromise and settlement authority that exists under the Higher Education Act instead of the HEROES Act, which relies on an emergency COVID status for the debt to be canceled, then he would not have encountered the legal obstacles that he's encountered now. What do you say to people who say, what difference does it make to have more progressives in office if we can't get Biden to follow through on these basic promises that he could enact via executive order?
Well, the progressives in Congress in the last one helped with the largest climate investment in the history of the country, made sure that we had an expansion of the child tax credit. Now we're pushing for it to be permanent, but that cut dramatically child poverty, massive investment in our schools. So we got a considerable amount done. And of course, it was our activism that got the president to forgive some of the student loans. Some of us are pushing for even more. Now, if there is another way to do it that would meet the criteria of this court, then we'll advocate that. And the president can, I'm sure, use that authority if he needs to. But I think what he has done is legal, and we should be fighting for the legality of what he has done.
But Representative Khanna, of course, no debt has been canceled thus far because of the means-tested nature of it. Conservatives were able to mount these challenges. And even progressive commentators like Judge Sugarman at Fordham Law School have pointed out that under the legal authority that Joe Biden has chosen, it is likely that it's not just that conservative judges will rule against this if it gets to the Supreme Court, but that all judges, this could be a 9-0 decision, because the hook using the HEROES Act, a post 9/11 authority, is a relatively weak one. Do you have any insight into why Joe Biden chose to use the HEROES Act as opposed to using the Higher Education Act, which is the authority under which student loan debt is currently being postponed?
I don't know the details of the legal decisions. I mean, my understanding is he asked his lawyers, his legal team, what was the best way to do this, and this was the recommendation. But this is easily fixed. I mean, if there is a better way to do it, I'm sure the administration will. The important thing, though, is to note that many people in the administration still believe that this is a winnable case, and it was a Republican-appointed judge who struck it down. So we need to fight to ensure that the Republican Party and their judges aren't taking away student debt relief. And again, if we need something to fix it in Congress in the lame duck, or if the president has other means to do it, then we should be open to that if this fails for some reason.
Representative, I want to ask you about funding for Ukraine. Obviously, there was this kind of brouhaha over this, what I thought was a perfectly sensible or mild letter from some Democratic House progressives, asking that as we continue to fund Ukraine's defense, that the Biden administration would push for renewed diplomacy, that, it shouldn't be this no strings attached kind of endless support. This is obviously something that some Republicans actually in the House have become very vocal about. It's been interesting to see a kind of, I think, ascendant anti-interventionist faction within the GOP. What are your thoughts on these dynamics? And I know you're someone, a progressive who, probably feels and has voiced opinions kind of in line with Brianna's and mine on this issue. What is the, I guess, likelihood of progressives and maybe even some Republicans who would not agree on anything else, working together to press for an end to this war via diplomacy?
As you know, I stood by the CPC letter. To me, it seemed pretty vanilla. All it was saying is Putin's war is unjustified, it's unprovoked, it's illegal. We stand with Ukraine, but we want to make sure that we have diplomacy to minimize the risk of the war escalating, to minimize the risk of nuclear confrontation, to minimize civilian casualties. And look, Putin has put 300,000 troops on the border and in Ukraine, but he can mobilize up to 3 million. And he's systematically striking electricity supplies and utilities in Ukraine. So he is a brutal person, and we should not underestimate how brutal he will be and continue to be. So I have continued to say that I support standing with Ukraine, but I support diplomacy and communication with the Russian counterparts. Lo and behold, it turns out all the generals agree with me. And the New York Times has been filled this last week with general after general saying that that's a prudent approach.
So then to what do you attribute all of the brouhaha about the letter?
I don't know. I think it was much ado about nothing, to borrow the famous Shakespeare quote. I mean, I don't think that the letter was controversial when written. I don't understand why we retracted it. That's why, if you notice, I went on television actually and supported it because the letter was not saying anything about funding actually. And my position has been voting for every funding package. I've been criticized from people to my left for that. All the letter was saying is that we need diplomacy. We had diplomacy at the height of the Cold War. We would never have convinced Russia, in my view, to leave Afghanistan if we weren't at the same time talking to them while we were arming the Mujahideen. President Reagan engaged in diplomacy. Most of our leaders, Republican and Democrat, have engaged in diplomacy. So I was a bit surprised why that has suddenly become a controversial position.
Well, Representative, I want to switch gears and ask you a little bit about the speakership race. When asked if she would support House Speaker Nancy Pelosi for another term as Democratic leader, or if she herself planned to fight for the seat, Representative Jayapal skirted the question, instead explaining the CPC considers all people who are running and how they match up to the set of things the CPC asks for.
On Monday, you answered that same question by saying that Pelosi deserves the chance to lead after her courage in certifying the 2020 election following January 6th. Can you elaborate on your thoughts here?
Well, I think the Speaker has shown remarkable courage after the horrific incident on Paul Pelosi. A lot of people would just say, I'm done with politics. She has stayed out there on the battlefield. She also showed courage in certifying the January 6th results. And we've massively overperformed in the election in terms of what people were expecting. So she deserves the chance to say what she is doing. I have no insight into what she wants to do, whether she wants to contest for leadership, whether she wants to stay in the Congress, not in leadership, whether she wants to do something else. But from my vantage point, she's earned the right to make that decision.
What do you say to people who might argue that who should be a leader, whether minority leader or majority leader, should be less about their kind of personal deservedness, whether or not they showed courage in the face of 1/6 or have suffered personal tragedy with respect to her husband being, brutally attacked, but instead should be more calculated to the interests of the people, especially if you're speaking from the perspective of a CPC member, what is in the best interest of progressives. Some progressives, like AOC when she was running for office, made a point of saying that Nancy Pelosi doesn't represent her interests and would not get her vote as a default for Speaker of the House. That seemed to have changed in the context of the force the vote discussion during the last speakership vote. What criteria is the exclusive criteria here, whether or not Nancy Pelosi is powerful and deserved on an individual level, or should there be some more consideration for whether or not she is effectively advancing the interests of the left?
Well, there should be a consideration of whether she's effectively advancing progressive ideals and standing up for democracy. I don't think her courage is just about her personal virtues. I think it is about someone tough who's going to take on election deniers, who's going to stand up for democracy, take up and stand up to Kevin McCarthy and some of the extreme elements of that caucus. And I have seen that she is a fighter on those issues. And obviously democracy was on the ballot this time. I've also seen that she has been able to stand up for a lot of progressive priorities in the negotiation. Some of the other folks in leadership aren't as sympathetic often to progressives. But I guess the question is always the alternative. And I don't. If someone were to emerge who I thought would do a better job, I'd obviously consider it. But right now, I think that she'd be good.
Is there no one being considered? Because this was a part of the conversation in the last cycle. The pushback against folks who wanted there to be a more competitive race for the speaker said that there was no one in the wings. And that seems to be a problem with the Democratic leadership, which is much older, especially when you look across the aisle at what's going on with Republicans. There are people openly mounting challenges to Kevin McCarthy right now. And Republican leadership generally seems to be more energetic and younger. Is a failure to cultivate or even to kind of ask questions about who could replace Nancy Pelosi causing there to be such a shallow bench on the left?
I don't think so. First of all, I don't think age is a consideration. I mean, I was proud to support Senator Sanders twice, and he's generated record enthusiasm among young people. So I think it's more about a person's convictions and what they want to do than
I would agree.
Whether someone is young or old. But I think there are a whole number of people who are going to be part of the next generation of leadership conversations. I mean, I'm not saying anything new. Hakeem Jeffries, Pramila Jayapal, Catherine Clark, Adam Schiff, and Joe Neguse, and that transition is happening, is going to happen. Whether it's for all the positions this time or some of the positions over the next term or two, you're going to see a whole new generation of people in many of these positions.
Is there any chance, given the very narrow majority Republicans will have in the House, of like all Democrats uniting and peeling off, a couple more moderate or maybe anti-Trump, whoever's left on the Republican side, and unanimously voting for some speaker who's not as far, is not as kind of entrenched in conservatism or Trumpism as Kevin McCarthy?
Well, you're talking about the Willie Brown maneuver. Willie Brown in my state of California managed to get elected speaker from the minority. I don't know if we have someone of that political skill in our caucus, but it's an intriguing possibility. Look, I'm talking to some of the Republicans with a small group. I don't want to get into the names about how we democratize the House and how we can have rules, at least, that allow members to introduce amendments, members to introduce bills to take to the floor without leadership blocking them. So you could, at the very least, get certain reforms through that members of the Republican caucus want, and maybe we have less centralized power. I think that's a more likely scenario than a consensus speaker emerging.
That would be fantastic. I know that's something Justin Amash, Libertarian representative, a former Libertarian representative, also wanted to see happen. So good luck with that, and please come and report back to us if you're successful in that regard. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
More Rising right after this.